very pleased to welcome, I just have to say, core members of the Center for Global Studies who all participate in various ways as faculty and as staff around the university in our cohorts and in all the activities that we perform. They lead in many cohorts, and they have participated in a number of our programs, so for instance, UW in Jerusalem, among others. I'm going to introduce, I think, everybody at the beginning, because we will be moving relatively quickly, because we've got a big, as you can see, a big panel tonight. We're going to lead with Nick Sweet, who's an assistant professor in anthropology, and he specializes in linguistic anthropology. His recent book is titled The Verbal Art of Mobility in West Africa, so he works a lot in Senegal and places like that. And his research focuses on Borderlands, and he founded a community-based field station in that area that hosts interdisciplinary anthropological research programs. And so, as I said, these are some of the leaders in UW globalization. And his languages, if you're interested, include, I'm going to mispronounce them, even though they look really straightforward, Pular to pronounce Wolof, and French I can do. And then we'll have Zoe Pearson, who's an associate professor of politics and international studies, and who traveled with on a UW in Scotland Tate Fellowship last year to study fishing in Scotland. She's a human geographer who studies the politics of illegal drug control in Bolivia and Central America, and resource extraction and conflicts in Ecuador. But more broadly, she researches and teaches nature-society relations, and that includes conservation and environmental change, and hence salmon in Scotland. And then we will have a team led by Chelsea Escalante. We love team building at UW in global studies. As you know, that's what the cohorts focus on various regions are all about. And when we take our faculty traveling internationally, they build new relationships across disciplines that really make a difference in our research, and then what we can bring back to our students. And so Chelsea is an associate professor of Spanish with expertise in international relations and sociolinguistics. She focuses on cultural context for and community dynamics behind language choices. I think you were a UW Presidential Fellow recently, weren't you? Yes. And she led the reconstruction of the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research. Nigh teaches international studies, focusing on the Middle East, and his experiences have taken him to Jordan and Iraq to learn language and to work in local development NGOs. Eric leads classes across the MENA region, and his students regularly star in U.S. Model Arab League. I bet you didn't know that. UW is awarded at Model Arab League. And Conor McCracken-Flesher is here drawing on his studies in conflict resolution and coexistence, which are focused on the Near East and Judaic studies. He lived in Jerusalem for a year, studying language. He worked in Jordan with an NGO focused on the protection of journalists, and his degrees are from Boston and Brandeis universities in those fields. So I'm going to turn it over to, having flipped the program, Nick Sweet.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Is everyone, can you all see me better if I stand up? This is good. We'll try it. So thanks so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here. Nick Sweet. I'm from, should I use this mic? Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, sweet. I am from Virginia. I got interested, I'm a linguistic anthropologist, and for those of you who don't know what that means, linguistics generally is really interested in the structural aspects of language. And my field, we're really interested in exploring the social dimensions of language, what it does, everyday communication, face-to-face interaction, language ideology. I'll talk about a couple of these things in a little bit. So we're really invested in learning local languages, investing ourselves in it, and learning what we can from everyday conversations. So, I was a French major in university, and I went to West Africa, and I realized that it was almost useless to me because every day everyone was speaking Wolof and Pular, all these other languages, and that to really understand the richness of social life there, I had to learn multiple languages because people were really multilingual. So. I got really interested in languages from my background. I come from a German-American family, and I was forced to speak German at home, and if I didn't speak German with my mother and father, I didn't get my allowance. So I spent my life looking for an opportunity to explore language in everyday conversations and in everyday contexts, and this is the field that I'm in. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about some research that comes out of a project that I've been working on for a long period of time. I got into West Africa after my university, my bachelor's degree. I joined the Peace Corps for several years and spent 3 years in Senegal. And for those of you who need to orient yourselves, we're here in West Africa. And I got sent to the southeastern corner here in Senegal, the region of Kédougou. And Kédougou is on the Gambia River, which flows all the way to the ocean. And when I got there, it was a place it's the kind of place you could take a nap in the main drag in the downtown market. You could just take a nap in the street, and there's maybe one motorcycle that would drive by you, and you'd be okay. And by the time I left as a Peace Corps volunteer, there was migrants came all over from neighboring regions, from South Africa, from Guinea, from Burkina Faso, and it became I didn't recognize the town anymore. So this project that I'm about to talk to you about is kind of an exploration, a linguistic exploration of what happens in a context of social change like the one that we're seeing in Kédougou, that is seeing an explosion of growth, the building of gold mines, people coming in, commerce, sellers, roads being built, all within a very short period of time. So this social context that I'm talking to you about in southeastern Senegal, there's a long tradition of gold mining in this area, but starting in 2008, industrial gold mines from South Africa, from Canada, started coming in and building up. There's an international highway that is built. All of a sudden, you can get there on paved roads, and Kédougou becomes a region, whereas previously it was kind of administered as a department and not a lot of oversight from the government. And then during the time that I conducted this field work, not during the time that I was a Peace Corps volunteer, this was right during the Ebola epidemic, if you remember. It started in Guinea, spread to Liberia and Sierra Leone. So during the time that I was doing this research, being from abroad, being a migrant and being from away was a very big deal. And people were constantly monitoring signs of being away through language, through dress, and through all of these different things. So what are we trying to do here? This project is all about exploring mobility, not through the lens of passports and roads and border stations, but what can we learn about being a migrant or being mobile if we pay attention to everyday moments of people using language and interaction. And if you think about it, so this is kind of this is a picture of migrants coming across the Mediterranean Sea. If you read the news, there's a lot of news about West African migrants trying to make it to Italy, trying to make it to Spain, to France, to seek a better life. But being a migrant, there's tons of migration within Africa as well, and everyone seems to focus on these things, but West Africa has a history of being very, very, very mobile, and people have moved for a long period of time. So let's rethink what it means to be a migrant. And being a migrant is not just something you do, and you are, but you perform it. Let's just think about even the status of seeking asylum or being a refugee in another country. To be a refugee, you have to prove yourself. You have to have the right knowledge of spaces. You have to have the right stories of who your family is. You have to speak the right languages. You have to know the right things in order to be able to be accepted as a migrant. So using the lens of languages teaches us a lot about how migrants succeed in new places, the kind of mechanisms they use, kind of languages they use to succeed in these different kinds of places. I was just in Germany a little while ago, this summer, a couple weeks ago, and Germany is currently kind of reeling from and grappling with the acceptance of a large number of migrants also from West Africa, from Syria, from Ukraine. And when you actually talk about people, they're having difficulty with migrants, but when you actually talk to people about what's so hard, a lot of these issues come out in these very simple interactional questions, like, how loud are you able to be in your apartment? And Germans have very strong ideas about noise level, how you have to moderate, the tone with which you talk to your children. In West Africa, you can yell at your children, and that is exciting. It's an acceptable way to discipline your children. And in Germany, these kind of things, these very simple interactional questions of what volume do you use to talk to people really mediate how people find belonging in these new kinds of places. So being a refugee and being a migrant is partly a performative question of how you mobilize and how do you utilize language. And what I'm trying to show in this larger project is that language is not just something that reflects the world. It doesn't reflect your experiences of a migrant, but it kind of constitutes them. And you see this in the research on mobility and migration all the time, where scholars, they commonly just ask interview questions. So, how was your experience as a migrant? And so language there just reflects stories of what happened. And what we're trying to show in this project is that language is a social action in and of itself. It does things. It creates connections. It shapes the place that you're in. Language is not just this medium that floats above the world, but it shapes it. Migrants, when you have migrants from Guinea in a Katigu downtown market, when they're using in-law registers, when they're using registers of kinship, they're shaping the market into a domestic space where they can share food, invite people into their homes, and they're quite literally changing the place that they're in. So language is not something that just floats above the world here, but it really helps people to constitute the place that they're in. So language shapes spaces and doesn't just kind of float above them. So let's think of mobility as a verbal art, and I'll give you a couple examples of what we might learn through this. Again, not just looking at passports, roads, but looking at refusals, looking at blessings, looking at how people greet, looking at the kind of signs that people give off. So in my field, we're really interested in language, but more broadly, we talk about semiotics. And semiotics is this kind of complicated word that has a really simple meaning. Semiotics means something that stands for something else. And I'll give you an example of what this was. We were camping as a family last weekend at the Wyoming Sheep and Wool Festival, and my wife was doing some ethnography with sheep growers, wearing a nice Wrangler shirt and jeans. And then I show up with my kids in bright orange shirt, shorts, and a LL Bean cap, and we're listening to Manu Chao on the radio. And I show up there, and everybody just from my dress is assessing me for where I'm coming from, right? Who I am, right? And my wife had curated her dress to fit in, right? And these kind of signs are things that people hear through language all the time, right? When I use the word y'all, when we use double negatives, when you use certain kinds of turns of phrase, they're not just words, but they reflect really strong social meanings and give people indices about where you're from, what your objective is, who you are, and what you might want somewhere. And these kind of things are really, really critical in a migrant's world, where being from Guinea, being from the high altitude mountains of Guinea, where there is Ebola, might be a really critical thing when you're coming across the border. So people are always scrutinizing each other through their language, through their dress, and trying to learn more about each other. So being a migrant is not just a question of you are or not, but it comes to being through language. I spent a lot of time in some of these downtown markets. These are markets that just didn't exist while I was a Peace Corps volunteer. And all of a sudden they grow. They're Chinese motorcycles being sold along cola nuts. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a second. People are selling phones, they're selling cars, they're selling clothes, they're selling trinkets, they're trying to make money, they're coming in to assess gold, they're coming in to buy water, and a lot of these guys are migrants from Guinea, young men who are trying to make it in this kind of gold mining economy. And a lot of these guys, when I first came in and got to know these guys, they started calling each other really interesting names. Naming is a really interesting thing. I think some more people in our panel talk about names. But they started calling each other things like orange or grapefruit or Spain. What I realized was there's this really interesting genre of nicknaming going on in the market. And where all these guys, these migrants, had nicknames that corresponded to migratory misadventures. But what's interesting about it is that it was a pay-to-say kind of taboo mechanism. So in order to be able to say the nickname, you either had to be there, you had to be at the moment where the thing happened, where the guy's grapefruit spoiled on the border and they lost thousands of dollars, or you could pay money and goods to the people to be able to say these things. And these are the kind of mechanisms through which people assessed and kind of scrutinized each other as migrants. And one of these guys, it's kind of a sad story. I got to know one particular man who they called Sarvet, which means towel, kind of like a bath towel. And he was called Sarvet because he had spent 4 years in Mauritania as a migrant trying to make money, and he'd come back with very little money. He'd not really made it. And really, the kind of crux, the really interesting question is here, how can you stay away for 4 years of your life? How can you be a migrant, go somewhere else, be away for 4 years, and yet when you come back, you're not a migrant? Because for these friends that he'd left behind, they were assessing him with questions of like, did he know the local languages of Mauritania? Did he come back with money? Did he come back with new bags, with new clothes? And he had to prove, in a way, that he had made it and that he had the status of a migrant. And this nickname, Sarvet, and the nickname came from the situation where he essentially lived with his family, and the joke was that he just sat around wrapped in a towel in the courtyard for 4 years. This kind of followed him, right? And it was a caustic teasing. It was hard to hear, but it was also jovial, it was also joking, and it was this really interesting way that people were coming to terms with and establishing themselves as successful migrants, as people who had made it, who had not, and simultaneously kind of creating a kind of camaraderie, right? Out of misadventures, out of this really difficult situation that they found themselves in, and this kind of pay-to-say kind of genre made it so that that they looked after each other, and they had this kind of secret language that they could use to keep track of each other. So one of the things that we're beginning to notice here is that language is not just about language as code. Often we think about languages as like, what kind of languages do you speak? Well, I speak English, German, Wolof, Pulaar. But those are just names of languages as you might read them on a list, right? It doesn't tell you a lot about the genres you might know. You take me out to a cattle farm here, and you're gonna know that I don't belong, that I'm not from Wyoming. You're gonna know that I'm not from here. I don't master that. But you take me to a kitchen, you take me to Senegal, I can joke around with all these genres that you all know, these aspects of language that everyone masters, that don't always line up with the names of languages as these kind of parent things. So one of the things that becomes really interesting here too is when you start looking at interaction more closely. Oftentimes when you read about migrant and mobility, you might get things like this, just like this is a narrative about someone's life. I'm not going to go into details, and you don't necessarily have to read it, but this is the story of Sarvet, essentially. And you could read it here as a paragraph and say, oh, I've learned something about this person. This is the story that this person experienced. But if you actually look at the textures of interaction, if you actually look behind the scenes and look at the turn taking, if you look at the different kind of languages, the different kinds of styles that are used in these kind of interactions, you really notice a lot of kinds of other social actions and things that are going on. So you notice here that this story is being told over and over and over again. It's not just being told once, but in that repetition, it creates new audiences. It shares that story over and over and over again, and it solidifies things like Sarvet as a Jamore nickname, right, that has staying power. When you start having multiple people telling the story, they start telling it in different languages. They start trying to demonstrate their knowledge, maybe their proof of themselves as a successful migrant, right? That they can tell the story in multiple languages. Sometimes clarifications happen through these different ways, right? So again, we're in linguistic anthropology. We're not just looking at a story and saying, this is it, 3 minutes. But we're saying these are the nuances that we see in this interaction. And we're seeing like everyday conversations is really valuable. Really important things happen around everyday conversations, around a kitchen table, and not just in great works of poetry, not just in political oratory, right? But in everyday kind of things. So to be a successful migrant in West Africa is to master all these kind of genres. I talked about jamore, this is the teasing nickname that I briefly mentioned. There's other genres like cousinage, a joking relationship. There might be a joking relationship between us and, right, what is Colorado State, right? If you ever see a Colorado Stater as a cowboy, you might be able to rag on them, to insult them, right? There's really interesting joking relationships in West Africa that happen between people's last names and their kind of caste groups. West Africa has a caste system. And these are the kind of technologies that people use to create relationships, to succeed, to establish relationships with people from abroad, from afar. They create fictive or establish in-laws relationships with somebody. Or, so there's all these kind of really intense, very dense genres, linguistic genres that people use across West Africa to create relationships with people across space. So this is just an example of that. Somebody walks in with the last name Jallo, somebody walks in with the last name Ba. They would immediately start talking about each other, insulting each other, using language. You would never see it in any other context. But here it's legitimized. And I've seen Jallos from as far away as Niger coming and finding a place to sleep because they were able to kind of start up a conversation with somebody with the last name Ba and to make that work. So let's think about language not just as something that represents that stories, but something that is quite literally a form of infrastructure. When we use language, it's a physical thing. It is a material thing, right? And there's all these different ways in which migrants use these genres, use language to create pathways between their homes. So these pathways also bring them back. Things like guilt. Right? The mother of a migrant, you don't even belong here anymore. You're not even from here anymore, right? Things like that create this compulsion to come back. So these highways, these paths that are created by people through language to kind of to aid them along and to integrate into new places, or to prevent them and to make it harder for them to integrate in places. So language creates borders. Language creates places. People create space, and migrants create space that they live in, partly through the language that they use. It's not just a form of storytelling that floats above the world. So I think that's all the time I have. Is that right?
Just about.
All right. So I'll leave it there. Would love to answer any of your other questions at the end. Thanks so much.
We're getting a taste of things right now, but there will be a question here. Yeah. What's that? Is this?
All right. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks to CGS for supporting this research and many other entities on campus, which I'll thank at the end. I'm Zoe Pearson. I'm in the School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies, and I'm a geographer by training. And so I'll get a little bit into how that matters to this current project. As Carolyn mentioned, historically, my research has been in Latin America, mainly in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Central America. And so this has been a departure for me moving into research in the UK. But my mom is from the English-Scottish borderlands. And growing up, she would take us to visit family. Essentially, our whole family is there. In fact, I need to know. There we go. Okay, there we go. So she's from Carlisle, which is this city here, and you can see Scotland to the north, England to the south, and that waterway in between is the Solway Firth. So that's what I'll be talking about today. My grandfather, my mother's father, he didn't have land himself, but he basically lived off the land. He fished, he hunted, he kind of trapped vermin for farmers, things like that to make money. And growing up and visiting him, he would talk about half net fishing. And this is something he did, and his son did, and his son's son, my cousin. This is a picture right here of my great uncle, Cyril, carrying a half net, which I'll talk more about soon, out of the water of the Solway Firth. So I kind of, grew up knowing about this. I didn't think that much of it. I actually thought it was spelled H-A-L-F, half net fishing. It was only a couple years ago that I realized how it was spelled when we were visiting, and my mom and myself were asking my uncle, and my cousin, whether they were fishing anymore when they had last been fishing, and they said they weren't fishing anymore. And so I asked, why have you stopped fishing? And basically they had kind of a few reasons, but it kind of came down to blaming the government, that there were just too many restrictions placed on the fishing. And so, as a human environment geographer, as Carolyn mentioned in my intro, as someone who studies kind of the relationship between people and nature, how natural resources are extracted and the kind of politics of that, I sort of got my wheels spinning about a research project related to this that would also take me closer to family, help me learn more about my past and my heritage. So that's how I got here today. And I did start this research, kind of initial exploratory research last summer, and I have since received a Fulbright scholarship to go next year for about 5.5 months. I'll be in the UK, in England and Scotland, based out of Durham University, and studying this further. So this is kind of the initial framing of the project and what I have learned so far. So what is half net fishing? It's a form of fishing that's unique to the Solway Firth. It's said to have come to this region 1,000 years ago from Vikings. It is only practiced here. It's one of the oldest forms of fishing in the UK. And it basically involves these huge nets that individuals carry. The long horizontal bar is about 17 feet long. The side legs are about 5 feet, and the middle stick, as they call it, is 6.5 feet tall. You can see, compared to a person who's carrying it, it's quite a big net. They're very heavy, as I found out. And historically, people would stand side by side, as you can see these pictures, across the Solway, and they work with the tides, either the tide coming in or the tide coming out. And they try to capture salmon and trout especially, but sometimes they also get other species like flounder. And you can see from above here, the net streams out behind the person's in the middle, and they try to basically catch the fish with the tide. And so it requires a pretty deep knowledge of tides. It's pretty dangerous. This region has a very strong and very high tide. It comes in and out very strongly and quite a lot of meters of water every day. This region is also characterized by mud flats that basically act like quicksand. And so these people have a really strong knowledge of their environment, of how fish behavior works, how it works with the slope of the shore, of course the tides, and all the sort of environmental factors, climatic factors, and things that go along with fishing. So the Solway Firth region, and here's another map, so you can see it in relation to the UK. And so we're talking mainly about Cumbria and Dumfries and Galloway, and the sort of surrounding villages, and then to some extent the cities. People come from the cities to do this type of fishing as well. And I forgot to mention that Haaf, the word Haaf, H-A-A-F, means, supposedly, in Old Norse means sea or channel. Solway, Firth means inlet, and so it's an estuary and it's an inlet, and it's quite big, as you can see. When the tide is out, you can almost, or you can at certain times of year, walk all the way from England to Scotland if you're quick enough to not get swept up in the tide. So you can see either country from either side. All right, this region, the Solway Firth, is designated as a national landscape, including the sea, salt marshes, hillsides, farms, and mudflats that I mentioned. And I also mentioned that it has very large tidal range. but also has a really interesting human history. So there are traces of infrastructure from Roman times, from medieval times, documentation surrounding the bloody border wars between Scotland and England around this region. In more recent history, it's been a site of tourism for hundreds of years. It's been a site of munitions factories for both world wars. Farming of various kinds. There's even a wind farm there now in the Solway. And to me, it really, when I was out there this last summer, these are pictures of my own, and I tried to find some more artistic pictures by photographers. So this is like, I'm not a good photographer. I have the cheapest, oldest iPhone you could possibly have, and still, I guess, the screen's a little bit blue, so maybe it's not totally captured, but it's just such a beautiful landscape. And it really made me think of the term big sky country. Like, it reminded me of Wyoming and Montana. The weather can change very fast, like Wyoming, big clouds coming in, big winds. So what exactly is this project? Part one of the project is the research. And so the idea is to do research on the personal, sociocultural, political, and economic conditions leading to the disappearance of half net fishing over the last 50 years. So as I said, family members mentioned they're not fishing anymore. A lot of people aren't fishing anymore. And I, as someone who studies kind of human-environment relations and the politics of that, I know that it's usually more simple than just, the government's restrictions are stopping us from fishing, right? So I wanted to dig deeper and learn more. To study also the social and cultural importance of half netting to its practitioners, the environmental and ecosystem conditions that both relate to half net fishing decline and are also influenced by other fishing and fisheries practices in the region, and half netters' efforts to continue half netting. And then the second part of the project, which is mainly what I'll be focusing on next year when I'm there for several months, is to create a public exhibit and website designed for educators and the public so that the history and culture and ecological knowledges surrounding half net fishing can be preserved for future generations. And so for this component of the project, I'm going to curate an historical archive of kind of half netting oral histories, documentation, stories from interviews in the media, artifacts like nets and license tags and photographs, and I'll draw from this archive to create the website and a museum exhibit. And then I'll store everything with the local archives when I'm through. So I'll just talk a little bit about my research from last summer, which again is kind of the first stage in what I'm envisioning as a longer project. Certainly will be there for quite a while next year. So as it pertains to the archive, I didn't start that aspect of the project, that kind of part two, very much last year. But I was amazed by how much of the archive of half net fishing is basically in people's homes. So the people I interviewed would say, hold on a second. They come out with a cardboard box, old photocopies of black and white photographs, holding on to their brass fishing licenses that would have to be nailed to, the wooden beams of the nets. Just random, I don't know, information, pamphlets, documents, things that people collected. I did go into the formal archives, both in Scotland and in England, in the region, and you can kind of see, I think I have another picture of a document like this later, but it's like a super moldy, kind of really old document. This document was from 1756, and it was about a drowning of a half-net fisherman. So I was kind of both looking to see last summer what was in the actual official archive and then starting to collect these items, understanding, having been in the archive, that there really isn't a lot, and that part of the goal of this is just really to preserve this knowledge because it probably will disappear in the next decade or so, the actual practice of it. And then what I was mainly doing last summer was interviews, participant observation, going on walks and tours with half-net fishers to see the various fishing grounds in the Solway, to kind of map out the different villages around the Solway. I visited the fishing hut where they keep the nets in Scotland, the marsh grasslands where they keep the nets, in some cases on the England side. And that's me fishing. Like I said, it was very heavy, it was very hard to carry. And when I went out with a few guys, I was very surprised how strong that tide came in, how the wind really made it hard to stay standing and hold the nets, and it really gave me a respect. And of course, you know, they were being easy on me and obviously not trying to get me killed. And it was still pretty impressive. I had a very deep respect for the Solway after that. So again, trying fishing, lots of interviews, lots of collection of, you know, whatever information I could basically find. And so I just want to talk about a couple of the main themes that kind of came up. I really don't have any conclusions yet. Like I said, I'm kind of in the beginning stages. But what I learned last summer is leading to, you know, a lot more questions and a lot more avenues for research that I want to pursue. So one of the main themes, of course, was the local social and economic significance. And again, I'm interested in kind of the cultural heritage aspect, why this is important to people, how it's important to people, why people have done this, why the few hangers-on are continuing to do this, and what it means to them. So one, you know, big theme that came up was, probably not that surprisingly, was class. There's definitely, half net fishers historically have been working class people, people who need it for money, need it for the food. And in fact, I think most people actually didn't save it for the food because they really needed the money more than they needed the food, because salmon was quite a high value product to be eating. So you see an old photograph here of a family with their catch. This painting hangs in a pub, and I was told that it was a replication of supposedly the largest salmon ever caught by a half net fish, 82 pounds. And part of what was so interesting is like so many people just had stories like the largest fish ever caught, right? People told stories about, you know, the time so-and-so almost drowned, the time they almost drowned, all this kind of folklore around half net fishing. Anyway, so this fish supposedly, the man who caught it on the Scotland side, he was like a tenant farmer. He rented, or you know, he used the little hut on some farmer's property. He worked the farm. And on the Scotland side, part of what you know, I'm learning and is important to this sort of political story is how different the restrictions have been on the two different sides, and how that's also led to conflict between England and Scotland around half net fishing, and also how just how different the different ways people have been able to gain access to the fish. In any case, on the Scotland side, it was a private landowner, but the private landowners, if their workers would help them set up their stake nets, which were permanent nets that would catch the fish and basically kill them, then they would be allowed to half net on their property. And so this man, 82-pound fish, one day out there half net fishing, the story goes, he ran, you know, up to the landlord's house. They like threw him in the cart because the trains to London were leaving soon with all the fish they'd already bought for the day. They weighed the fish. It's like the biggest fish anyone's ever caught with a half net. The guy gets so much money, he doesn't even have a bank account. So his landlord says, well, I'll give you the house that you live in and some of the property and whatever. And then the man went on to be like, supposedly still today, his family owns the land. There's like a huge hotel on it. They became super rich off of this one fish. So anyway, it's a nice story. I need to make sure that the person who told it to me, that we get that written down for the archive. But stories like this, people are really into just the history of this and the importance to the region. Okay, I didn't intend to tell that long story about that one fish. I got 5 minutes though. So like I said, so one of the things that was super interesting, lots of just great stories, incredible moments with wildlife, like seeing seals just attacking a pool where the salmon had gotten caught in the tide. My uncle had the receipt for the biggest fish he ever caught and like how much money he got off of it. I mean, people are really into this. As far as the kind of economic aspect, like I said, a lot of people, you know, really relied on the income from this. For a lot of people, it was extra income, you know, like certainly in the last few decades, with my family, you know, my uncle, my cousin, they had day jobs, but this would be extra money. My aunt said, like, I loved it when he would fish because then we get a little bit of extra money and I could use that to like buy new curtains or something. And, but back in the day, like my grandfather, he kind of lived off of the seasonality of fishing, hunting, and those sorts of things. People talked about it as self-sufficiency, you know, you at least knew you had some fish in the freezer if you did need it for food, or it was that kind of extra windfall, even if you had a regular job. And then, like I said, kind of different histories on different sides. I won't go any more into that. And then, also interestingly, was sort of the sort of social aspect. So before all the restrictions started coming down in the 80s and it became harder and harder to fish, and I'll go into that in a moment, it was a really tight-knit kind of social club to be a half-net fisher. People were part of what they called gangs, and if you just randomly showed up and you were a new person, they would tell you to, you know, hit the road. You had to know someone to get in. People would threaten to drown each other. People would push each other in. They were very territorial. Different gangs owned different spots. They would time themselves to get there at a certain time, or, you know, fake out the other gang and get there earlier than they said they would. You had to show up at a certain time to start the draw, because they have this system of basically drawing straws, but with these things in a bag that would tell you what position you had that day. And of course, as an individual, you want, you know, a good position based on how the tide is that day. So a lot of interesting kind of, you know, cultural, environmental aspects to this. People also, sometimes the gangs would like pool everything they caught and split the money. Other times, kind of each person for themselves. Each man for themselves, because mostly men. Although I did hear about one woman who's kind of famous in Scotland for being kind of like the woman that was a half-net fisher. Okay. And one quote that somebody told me was, you have to have a lot of field craft and be very observant. People talked about learning from like the elder generations, but also how much observation and kind of knowledge is involved in this. Okay. Just to show you how dedicated these people are, so I'm on the Scotland side doing an interview, and you can see this tiny black dot of a person silhouetted out there. That was, the weather was stereotype, rainy, cold, windy, gray, and this lone guy is out there half-net fishing. Like, people, you know, it's important to people's lives, whether or not they make very much money anymore. You can't really, because you can't sell. All right. So a little bit about the context of decline. And again, you know, I don't have any definitive answers, but there's certainly a lot of the same themes kept coming up in my interviews, people talking about reasons for, you know, people stopping the fishing. Like I said, a lot of blame placed on the government. There have been a lot of court cases, a lot of battles. This is just a letter I found in the archives asking if the parish council clerk rather would kind of help fight against the government from this time restriction. So what has happened since the 80s is that when you can half-net fish, how you can half-net fish, what fish you can take has basically been kind of slowly eroded. So you can no longer fish on weekends. Well, most people these days have day jobs in the week. You can no longer fish overnight. People told me stories of them fishing all night long by the moonlight. And now you can't even keep a fish. You can no longer keep even one salmon, and that's just the most recent of the regulations. People feel like they haven't been able to explain to the government authorities sort of their logic for why they should be allowed to keep at least one fish. Many people said if we could just keep one fish, you know, they're still doing it for the sport, they're still doing it for fun, but it's not the same as if they could at least keep one fish just to eat with their families. They're not trying to do it for money anymore. People are certainly aware of the kind of environmental context, right? The reason that the government has put so many restrictions in place, governments have put restrictions in place, is because there are fewer fish, right? The stocks are down. But instead of just looking to the sort of proximate causes of of the government being at fault, people point to the environmental factors, climate change, and then especially the political economic factors of fish farms, mainly in Scotland, that are resulting in lice being released into the ocean, which are infecting a lot of the younger salmon, who then never make it to the Solway and never make it up the river. And then another kind of interesting kind of political economic context is that there is this kind of animosity and conflict between rod fishers or anglers and net fishers in general. These are a couple things I came across just on like message boards. I won't go into it, but basically there is a lot of kind of conflict and tension, but it seems to me that that's kind of a distraction from the bigger kind of political, economic, and environmental issues that are facing salmon and the fishery stocks, and that are therefore leading to these kind of changes in terms of regulations. Okay. Carolyn is pushing me. I'm at time. Well, all right. I will just say that that's what it looks like when you catch a fish. And as a geographer, sort of bringing this back to what this means, I think, I'm really interested in how the local knowledges of this form of fishing practice, the kind of human-environment relations, what it means for cultural heritage, all kind of come together in placemaking, and what, this place means for all the different things it represents. It's very interesting to note that in every kind of touristic pamphlet or website about the Solway Firth, there are pictures of half-net fishers, and yet while the government is promoting this as such a cool cultural heritage and thing to come see, they're also putting into place so many restrictions that people can no longer fish. So I'll be exploring kind of those issues of representation and practice and placemaking. So thank you to all my sponsors, including the Center for Global Studies, and to research participants.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. My name is Chelsea Escalante.
I'm Conor McCracken-Flesher.
Eric Nigh.
And we're here to talk about our project that took place through our participation in the University of Wyoming in Jerusalem program that Caroline led a couple of years ago. We come from different disciplines and backgrounds, but we came together with a unified interest in language and linguistics and signage in Jerusalem, and so we are collaborating on this project named Naming and Claiming How Jerusalem's Street Signs Reflect a Divided City.
So just to start off, we're going to fly through this. We have lots of slides, 26. So you can read a bunch of this stuff, and I'll just say some brief stuff. So it's just a little bit of background. Pre-48, the context of Israel-Palestine, up to World War I. For several hundred years, this area had been under jurisdiction of the Ottoman Empire. From World War I to World War II, basically British control. And so there's a lot of changes happening from the beginning of the 20th century up through 48 and then the 67 that involved large influxes of Jewish immigrants coming from Europe because of anti-Semitism, because of racism, because of war, right, Holocaust. And so this changes the landscape of this place, and we have to appreciate that. I always tell my students, imagine that during COVID, 1 million people from California just decided to migrate to Wyoming, right? How would we feel about that, right? It would definitely cause conflict. There would be people with new ideas coming in, new ways of life, things like this. So it's just important to try to understand that context of the mass demographic change that this country, this area is going under during this time. So after several Arab-Israeli wars and peace agreements, and sort of a focus on now since 67 really, and after 80 really, when peace agreement was signed with Egypt, it became more of a focus on internally what's going on between Jewish Israelis and namely Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. So how are those relationships playing out? Oslo Accord, several attempts to achieve sort of a peaceful coexistence. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that Israel doesn't have a constitution. It has a series of basic laws that are supposed to form a constitution. And one of the basic laws that was recently passed in 2018 was that Israel, by the way of how Israel found itself as a nation, established in their basic law that Israel would never become anything other than a Jewish state. So race is written into the Constitution of Israel. So this is important. And why is that? Because, well, Israel wants to guarantee safety for Jews. If the numbers ever swing and we went after a one-state solution, there may be more Palestinians and Israelis, and then Israelis would feel threatened. And the whole reason that the immigration happened to this place was so that Jews could protect themselves. So this is sort of very, very important to understand. So where does this leave the Palestinians? This is in a de facto apartheid state. I'm sorry, like we just have to call a spade here. Palestinians are subject to a higher power. Israel has more agency and power, and Palestinians, whether they're citizens or not, vast majority are not, are forced to abide by Israeli laws and Israeli security restrictions. Gaza now is basically a place under siege. Over 1 million Palestinians have little to no access to food. You can't even go into the sea to fish. You'll get shot. And so it's even in the West Bank, there are restrictions. We have to acknowledge the restrictions that Palestinians live under. Even if you're a peaceful Palestinian, you're subject to the hegemony of the Israeli state. And so this is the context that we're talking about, the power of linguistics.
Okay, so we're looking at the linguistic landscape in particular in Jerusalem. And what the linguistic landscape is, it's basically looking at public signage and analyzing what languages are present, absent in public signage, and what that can tell us about the society in general. So public signage can include signs, billboards, posters, displays, touchscreens, etc. Anything that is in public where language is present can be analyzed as part of the linguistic landscape. It could even include things like graffiti, artwork, etc. And the linguistic landscape can give us important information about what languages and dialects are valued in certain spaces. We might not always think of this in the US because our linguistic landscape tends to be very monolingual in the US, except for in some places in the Borderlands or in some bigger cities. There's some signs in other languages, but if you go to a multilingual city, especially some place like Jerusalem, you'll notice almost all signs have at least 2 languages and many times 3. And so being able to identify and study what languages are on these signs and what that means for the people that read those signs can give us important information about the people who identify with the languages. So how we can study the linguistic landscape of a certain space, we can look at the signage for a variety of different contexts. For example, actors or types of signs, so the people that put up the signs. Is it a government sign? Is it a private business sign? Is it an individual sign? We can also look at the function of the sign. So is the sign meant to sell something? Is it meant to regulate behavior in some way, like a no parking sign? Is it meant to give information to a group of people, like come to the library to, read on Saturday? And we can also look at the design of the sign. So what fonts are used on the sign? How big is the font used? What colors are put on the sign? What images? What are the semiotics that those different things represent on the sign? And then we can also look at the message or the meaning of the sign. What are the connotations of the languages being used, and what can that tell us about the intended audience? So just to give you a couple of examples of signage from the U.S., these two signs come from downtown Eugene, Oregon. And the blue sign in the middle there says, "Welcome to downtown Eugene." You know, it gives information about what not to do in downtown Eugene. And it does include English and Spanish on this sign, in addition to images that help us to understand in case you don't speak those two languages. And what we can notice if we're doing a design analysis of this sign, one thing we might be able to deduce is that English is predominant on this sign. It might be the most important language of this space. Spanish plays a role in this space potentially, but it is a smaller font. It's in a color that's a little bit harder to see than the English, the color that the English is written in. I know the image right here on the screen isn't very easy to see, but the English is written in white and the Spanish is written in yellow, so it's a little bit harder to see. If we were looking at a message, doing a message or meaning analysis of the sign on the right-hand side, we can see that it says warning, aviso in Spanish. "You are being watched" is translated in Spanish to "se le ha visto," but if you speak Spanish, this is absolutely not something that would make sense to you. It does not mean you are being watched. And so it doesn't really have any, it doesn't make sense. And so this, if you were doing a message and meaning analysis of this sign, you might be able to deduce that the person putting up this sign does not speak Spanish or does not have access to resources that truly serve a Spanish-speaking population.
So moving to Jerusalem, this is a city with a population of 1 million Israelis and Palestinians. It is ideologically contested. It's a place that both national movements see as being their capital. But it exists in the Israeli context right now. So it is subject to Israeli language laws, and that is a status where Hebrew is the official language of Israel, meaning it's used in Israeli schools and government documents, media, all that stuff. Arabic was, as of a couple years ago, that law that Eric talked about, downgraded to a language with special status, which recognizes to some extent that it is a language that is important to a lot of people in this state. However, it is subordinate to Hebrew. So you are really only finding it in Arabic-speaking neighborhoods and in Arabic schools. English, of course, has no official status in the state, but it is, like in anywhere, it's the language of sort of the global world. It's aimed at visitors, shows up on signage there. And so it's important to note that, we're getting into the geography here, right? So Arabic and Hebrew are separated geographically, as are their speakers. So this contiguous part here, West Jerusalem, is pretty much uniformly a Hebrew-speaking area. Almost no Arabic spoken over here, which also inscribes it as Israeli. This over here is considered East Jerusalem, which was part of the West Bank, or is part of the West Bank, and was part of Jordan, in fact, between 1967 and 1973. Or sorry, from 1940 to 1967. So it is officially internationally occupied territory, but Israel considers it part of the state and considers it part of the Jerusalem municipality. So although it is under international law illegal to be moving civilians into occupied territory, this is something that has been going on. So when you have this contiguous Hebrew-speaking West Jerusalem, what is largely an Arabic-speaking East Jerusalem is nevertheless broken up and separated by Hebrew-speaking settlements in blue. The orange is the Arabic-speaking areas.
So a term we want to kind of just lay out here before we get into the results and the data analysis is this idea of normalization. So normalization, and for the intensive purposes of our research, and Dr. Escalante found this great definition from Krzyzanowski who in the context of linguistic anthropology, that basically takes a set of semiotics or discursive strategies and that is new, in other words, it's not established, introduces it to an existing system and forces it as normal. So puts it in places that are prominent, enforces it to stay there, like the renaming of streets, for example. Let's talk about like Mount St. Helens versus Denali, right? Like that was something that recently has, or the renaming of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. This is actually something that has really come out in the current administration that we have all sort of read about, and that's what's going on. Is we're changing a name, we're changing maps, we have the authority to enforce it in schooling systems, and this is forcing on a population that is used to another name or wants another name or grew up with another name, a new name, right? And saying this is normal, and it's normal. Why? Because it's on a sign. It's on a city endorsed sign, and we happen to be in control of the municipality, right? So that makes it therefore normal. And you either accept what's normal or you be abnormal. And who wants to be abnormal, right? We all want to be normal and fit in. So this is really important, that concept of understanding normalization. The normalization can also be understood in the context of normalizing relations between countries, and in the context of the Middle East, that's also been a word that's been thrown around, but it's a little bit different in the linguistic context. So our research questions, therefore, are how is this concept of normalization reflected in the linguistic landscape of Jerusalem? How do these various actors who control different sectors of social life, like how do they do normalization? And then what are the implications of this normalizing activity on Israeli-Palestinian relations? I want to also say, like, our goal here is to, we want peace, man. We want people to get along, and I think everyone that lives in this space also wants to get along. So what's the best way to do that, right? So what are the implications of this behavior on conflict, right, in this area?
Okay, so our first kind of set of data points comes from looking at the languages included and excluded on signs and the order of the languages in which they appear on signage in Jerusalem and in the surrounding areas. We know that signage is controlled, printed, posted, and maintained by the actor, meaning the person who's putting up the sign, with the greatest agency in the space. So that's usually the government, but also private businesses, individuals, etc., have agency to put up signs in certain cases. The languages present and absent on a sign tells us how the players in the space are ranked. Who is most important? Who is the sign meant for? Who is included in receiving information, and who is excluded from receiving information based on what's on the sign? And at times, the languages present and absent can be negotiated between actors. At times, it is coerced. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we found. Oops. So on government and municipality signs, you can see that Hebrew is almost always going to be on the first language on a sign. We have Hebrew here, for example. Usually Arabic comes second, but in this case, for example, English comes second. This is in the airport coming into Tel Aviv. We have Hebrew, English, Arabic. In the majority of the other ones, we have Hebrew, Arabic, and then English. A lot of times the Hebrew is in either a bigger font or a more bolded font than Arabic and English. And so that can lead us to think that Hebrew is the most important language in the space in terms of the government and municipality signs, and is being normalized as the language of the nation. When it comes to commercial signage, it's a little bit different. So we have a lot more of a mix. This is dependent upon the neighborhood in which the business is located and the intended clientele of the business. A lot of times we'll have Arabic and then English transliteration. For example, here we have just only Hebrew signs on establishments that are meant for just a Hebrew-only audience, Hebrew-speaking audience. We have Hebrew on the Coke can here with a little bit of English. We have some that are just only Arabic on their signage, and some that is actually only English, some that are Hebrew English, so a lot more combinations when it comes to the commercial signs. Here in West Jerusalem, and again, as Conor mentioned, West Jerusalem is almost completely Israeli, Hebrew speaking, sorry. And this is a context where on the signage we see almost always exclusively Hebrew or Hebrew and English only, but very, very little Arabic. And especially on religious signs that kind of nod to Jewish life, for example, this one here, we see like Arabic completely absent from this space.
And it's sort of important to note as well, West Jerusalem's a really good example of a place where the normalization has already happened, right? So there were Palestinian neighborhoods here before 1948, before the big war that pushed a lot of Palestinians into the east. But those are gone, and now the consistent overriding use of Hebrew has the effect of erasing evidence that they were ever there in the first place, and inscribes in the present their absence in the streetscape.
And then if we go to populate communities that have more Arabic speakers, we do see much more Arabic, a mix of Arabic and English usually included on public signage. So here, for example, we have Arabic and English. Same on these signs here. Here we actually have German and English and then Arabic. So depending on where you are, if you're in East Jerusalem, in the Old City Christian quarter of Jerusalem, and in the West Bank, it is much more common to find Arabic or Arabic English signage.
So for a sort of on-the-ground example of linguistic negotiation of space happening in real time, we're going to move to the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. This is a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, so it would have been part of Jordan from 48 to 67. It became resident to a number of Palestinian families that fled in 1948. So again, in international law, this is not an Israeli space. However, Israeli settler groups have been finding Jewish families with ownership documents that predate 1948 and bring them to court to overturn and evict Palestinians from ownership of these places. So it threatens these multi-generational Palestinian families without having anywhere to live. And then here we can see sort of we're seeing the actors on the ground making choices. So we do have a municipality sign, which is the same as the ones we've been seeing. It has Hebrew, Arabic, and then English, but it's sort of establishing their authority in that space. Here we have a house that has been moved into by Israeli settlers after evicting Palestinians. They have erected a sign up here that says Ligabolam. That means to their borders. It's a reference to passage in the Bible and a reference to the divine right of the land owed to the Jews and Israelis. But it's an exclusionary one, so it's one that implies by necessity the absence or expulsion of other groups of people such as Palestinians. And this might be a little hard to read, but there's a piece of graffiti here in Arabic that says Lan narhanu, and this is right across the street from these guys. So in response to this thing that says you need to get out of here, they're saying we're not going anywhere. And then finally, just on this one, we have some graffiti here that says Inkadu Hai Sheikh Jarrah, which means save Sheikh Jarrah, and that was a very prominent slogan in the time when this was really in the news. This neighborhood was in the news a lot in 2021 when these court cases were really going. But it's a really small neighborhood. It's just a couple streets right here as well. So this is a place where these people are really close together and constantly doing this linguistic debate. The thing we're going to sort of wrap up with is the issue of the names. So how do different actors use the names of the city? Because it turns out that this is actually an issue. In Arabic, the name Al-Quds is the primary name that the Arabic speakers use for the city. And that is true of Palestinian Arabs in Israel and Jerusalem and across the Islamic world. And frankly, many Christian Arabs as well. But the government of Israel has a different term that they would prefer to use. They use Urshalim, which is not something that any Arabic speaker that I've ever come across uses day to day. They always say Al-Quds. All the demonyms are Qudsi, Maqdisi, like referencing that name. And this has a really interesting effect because we're going to see a bunch of examples. It's kind of a transliteration of the Hebrew Yerushalayim, but Shalim comes from shalom, which means peace in Hebrew, but peace in Arabic is salam. So when you're making this transition, shalim, to you're overriding that s sound, the sh sound, you're inputting Hebrew characteristics into the Arabic inscribed space that weren't there before. And they use it a bit differently in different places. This is a road sign on the way to Jerusalem, but you're a little further away. So here, the municipality, again, the order of languages, Yerushalayim, Urshalim, Jerusalem, they've only used Urshalim. They don't use Al-Quds at all. They're not really concerned about what Arabic speakers think at this point. But here, a little closer to the city, they've included Al-Quds here. So Urshalim, but Al-Quds in parentheses. So they're like, really, we're calling this Urshalim because that's what we are considering it. Maybe you might know it by this other name, so we'll just include that as well. And this train station in the heart of West Jerusalem, but it is also I think it's a bus station, but it's the heart of the public transit system in the country. It only uses Urshalim, not Al-Quds. There's interesting quirks here, but I have to get through them really fast, so we're just going to focus on this one. This is a Muslim charitable foundation, Lejnat Zakat Al-Quds. What's really interesting here is that they've also said Al-Quds in English, Zakat Al-Quds Committee. So they are adding to this discourse by trying to insert into the English sphere knowledge of this other name, Al-Quds, that otherwise does not appear anywhere for English speakers. And then these last two are both examples of what a municipality does when it's trying to actually communicate to the Palestinian residents of the city. So this one on the left is for an anti-littering campaign, help us keep Jerusalem clean. And here, when they're trying to get the Palestinian residents of the city to do something in the positive, right, to pick up litter or to not litter, to put things in trash cans, they use Al-Quds. And they don't use Urshalim at all. They just use Al-Quds. They're meeting people on the level that they are at. On the other hand, this is just some Christmas well wishes. They're not really asking them to do anything. And here, the municipality uses Urshalim Al-Quds. So on the one hand, they're well wishing. They're kind of meeting people on their level, but they're also saying they're holding on to their own power and control in the situation by using Urshalim and putting Al-Quds secondarily.
So, basically to kind of sum this up, this normalizing linguistic behavior that is kind of hegemonically being used to force a new normal that this city belongs to a certain group that speaks a certain language, right? And that's and that is being resisted against linguistically as well. And we see that happening to a lesser extent when certain neighborhoods have the ability to control their own signage, when businesses are trying to appeal to certain people. I think it's just important to be. I think we're applied, we're researchers, but we're also sort of interested in an applied outcome here. And so we want a better world for everybody. We want Jews and Palestinians to be able to coexist, to live together. We want to avoid wars in the Middle East. And it's good to be aware of the power that is being wielded by folks with greater agency through language, right? I don't think we sort of really think about this a lot. Maybe we do a little bit more now today, but just to be aware of that, and scholars should be really taking the lead in pointing this out and how this works. And then I think that a second step here in the specific context is to say, stand with those with less agency and say, look, these guys have a voice too. If we want to reduce conflict for everyone in the future, we all have to be able to agree on what we call this place. We all have to be able to coexist together.
Thanks, everybody. That's it.